He finally got rid of the charity case, Vanessa announced, loud enough to silence the entire lobby. Then she grabbed the champagne flute from Claire's hand, held it up like a trophy, and emptied it slowly, deliberately onto Claire's shoes. Marble floor, 500 witnesses, zero hesitation. "Go home," Vanessa said, smiling, "before someone mistakes you for the cleaning staff." The room erupted in laughter, and not one person in that glittering Manhattan lobby understood what they had just witnessed. The woman standing in wet shoes, holding nothing, saying nothing, owned every single inch of the building they were laughing in. Her father built it. Before we go further, if you're new here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The invitation said 7 o'clock. Claire arrived at 6:55 alone in a black sedan she'd called from an app. Not a town car, not a private driver, just a regular sedan with a pine tree air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror and a driver named Marcus, who asked her 3 times if she was sure she had the right address. "This is the Whitmore Grand," he said, leaning forward over his steering wheel and staring up at the building like it had personally offended him. "You sure?" "I'm sure," Claire said quietly. "Big event tonight. Lot of fancy people going in." "Yes." She opened the door. "Thank you, Marcus." She stepped out onto Fifth Avenue and stood there for a moment. The building rose above her like something from a dream. 47 floors of glass and polished steel, the lobby lit from within like a lantern. A red carpet stretched from the entrance to the curb, lined with photographers and velvet ropes and women in gowns that probably cost more than most people's cars. Valets moved in choreographed circles. Guests arrived in processions. A woman in white fur walked past with a tiny dog tucked under one arm and a glass of something sparkling in the other hand. Claire looked down at her dress, knee-length, navy blue. She'd bought it 3 years ago for Ethan's firm holiday party, and she'd worn it twice since then. The fabric was good, she'd chosen carefully, but it was not this, none of this. She smoothed the front of it with both hands and walked toward the entrance. The doorman, a young man with kind eyes and an earpiece, looked her up and down in exactly the way people do when they're trying not to look like they're looking you up and down. "Name?" he asked. "Carter. Claire Carter." He scrolled his tablet. Scrolled again. A small frown passed across his face before he caught himself and replaced it with professional neutrality. "Of course, Mrs. Carter. Right this way." She followed him through the lobby and immediately understood why the invitation had come with a dress code note she'd chosen to ignore. The women here were wearing couture. The men wore watches that cost more than some houses. The lobby itself, the marble floors, the cascading floral installations, the bar that stretched the entire length of the east wall, it was extraordinary. It was excessive. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of thing her father would build. She found a corner near the edge of the main room and stood there with a glass of water watching. She was good at watching. She had been good at it for years. 7 years to be precise. 7 years of watching from the side of every room while Ethan Carter worked. The crowd shook the hands, accepted the praise for projects that wouldn't have existed without her. 7 years of watching him become someone she wasn't sure she recognized anymore, smoother, louder, hungrier, while she stayed exactly who she'd always been. Quiet, careful, invisible. She'd chosen that. She wanted to be clear about that even now. She had chosen to step back. She had chosen to let Ethan shine. She'd told herself it was love, and for a long time she believed it. She was still standing in her corner when the doors opened again and the whole room shifted, not physically, but you could feel it, that atmospheric change when someone enters who commands attention without asking for it. A kind of collective inhale. Vanessa Cole had that effect on rooms. She was 29 years old, 5'10" in 4-inch heels, wearing a dress that appeared to be made primarily of beading and confidence. Her hair was the kind of blonde that required monthly maintenance and a colorist who charged by the hour. She had a following of 4.3 million people on Instagram, a partnership with 2 luxury brands, and a way of entering spaces that made everyone inside them feel slightly less interesting by comparison. She was also, as of 8 months ago, the woman sleeping with Claire's husband, and Ethan was right behind her. Claire watched him walk through those doors and felt something complicated move through her chest. Not heartbreak, that particular wound had already done most of its bleeding. Something more like grief. Recognition. Because the man walking in on Vanessa Cole's arm was wearing a suit Claire had never seen before, an expression Claire didn't recognize, and a comfort in his own body that he'd never quite had when he was with her. He looked happy. He looked like he belonged. And standing there in her $40 navy dress with her water glass and her quiet corner, Claire understood something that hurt more than the betrayal itself. Ethan had never felt like he belonged with her. She had always known he was embarrassed by her choices, by the way she dressed, by the way she avoided parties, by the way she deflected when people asked about her family. She'd told him early on that she'd had a falling out with her father, that she preferred to make her own way, that money made things complicated. He'd accepted that, for a while. But wanting had always lived in Ethan Carter like a low fever, low enough to function, high enough to make him restless. And Vanessa Cole had walked into his life and turned that low fever into something burning. Claire watched them cross the room together. She watched Vanessa grip Ethan's arm like a flag claiming territory. She watched the way he scanned the room with that new confidence and the way the room responded, people moving toward them, hands extended, smiles offered. She watched. She said nothing. She had not planned to speak to either of them tonight. She had come to this event for her own reasons, reasons that had nothing to do with Ethan Carter or his girlfriend, and she had intended to do what she always did. Observe, decide, move quietly. But Vanessa Cole had other plans. Oh my God! The voice carried across the room with the precise weaponized volume of someone who has spent years performing for an audience. Claire looked up and found Vanessa already 10 feet away, moving toward her with the slow, deliberate walk of someone who wants to be watched making an entrance. Ethan was behind her, and something crossed his face when he saw Claire's surprise, discomfort, something that might have been guilt, before it was quickly smoothed over. Is that... Vanessa stopped in front of Claire and pressed one manicured hand to her chest like she was experiencing genuine shock. Ethan? Is that your wife? She actually came... The people nearby had already started paying attention. That was the thing about Vanessa. She never did anything quietly, and she understood instinctively that an audience made everything more effective. Vanessa, Ethan said, quiet and warning. She ignored him completely. She was looking at Claire the way people look at something unexpected, a bug on a restaurant table, a wrong note in a song. Honey, she said, and the word came out like a weapon disguised as a term of endearment. This is a black tie event. Claire met her eyes. I know. Do you... Vanessa tilted her head. Because... She let the pause do the work, her gaze traveling down Claire's dress, her shoes, her bag, an old leather tote Claire had carried for 6 years because it was well made, and she saw no reason to replace things that still worked. Okay, no. I don't even want to be mean. I'm just genuinely concerned. Who let you in dressed like that? Vanessa. Ethan's voice was sharper now. I'm serious. She looks like she wandered in from the subway. She leaned toward the woman standing beside her, someone Claire didn't recognize, someone who was already lifting a phone to film and stage whispered loudly enough for 12 people to hear. This is who Ethan was married to. Can you imagine? I keep telling him he should have upgraded years ago. The woman laughed. A few others nearby laughed. Someone turned to look. Then someone else. The small social contagion of public humiliation spreading outward in ripples. Ethan said her name again. Once. Quietly. And Claire thought not for the first time that she had married a man who would say her name quietly while someone dismantled her publicly and believed that counted as protection. That bag, Vanessa continued, because she was not finished, because she had never been the kind of person who knew when enough was enough. Is that... She squinted. Is that a real leather bag, or is that... She reached out and actually touched it, fingers pinching the strap. Oh, honey, no. That's not even real leather. That's what is that pleather in this building. She laughed again, and this time the laughter around her was louder, and Claire stood there and said nothing. Not because she had nothing to say, not because she was afraid, not because she didn't feel the eyes on her, or the heat of it, or the way the room had turned itself into a theater with her as the unintentional spectacle. She said nothing because she was in that moment doing something far more important than responding. She was deciding. She had been on the edge of a decision for months, a decision that would change the shape of her life entirely, that would require her to step out from behind the curtain she'd hidden behind for 7 years. She had been careful. She had been patient. She had told herself that she wasn't ready, that the timing wasn't right, that she preferred the quiet. But standing in this lobby in her $40 dress, while Vanessa Cole squeezed her bag strap and laughed, and Ethan said her name softly like an apology that cost him nothing, the decision made itself. "Thank you," Claire said. Vanessa blinked. "Sorry. For tonight." Claire's voice was calm, completely unnervingly calm. "I think tonight is going to be very useful." Something flickered across Vanessa's face, not quite uncertainty, but the precursor to it. A small animal instinct that knew somehow that the ground had just shifted slightly. But she covered it fast. She laughed higher this time and turned back to her audience. "Useful. Did you hear that she thinks tonight is going to be useful?" She shook her head. "Go home, sweetheart. Seriously. Before someone takes a picture of you in that bag and posts it. For your sake." Then she turned her back on Claire entirely, slid her arm through Ethan's, steered them both toward the center of the room where the real money was gathered, the real deals were being floated, and Claire watched them go. Then she set down her water glass very carefully on the tray of a passing server, and she took out her phone, and she made a call. It rang twice. "Claire?" The voice on the other end was low formal, with a particular warmth reserved only for her. "Are you here?" "I'm here, Dad." A pause. "And?" She looked across the room at Ethan Carter, laughing at something Vanessa had said at the diamonds at Vanessa's throat, catching the chandelier light at the 100 people around them who had no idea what was coming. "I think I'm ready," Claire said. Another pause. Longer this time. And then Richard Whitmore, one of the most powerful men in American real estate, the man who had built the very floors under their feet, said something he'd been waiting 7 years to say. "I'll be down in 10 minutes. She ended the call, put the phone in her pleather bag, which was for the record genuine Italian leather purchased in Florence during a trip she'd taken alone 6 years ago, and never mentioned to anyone. She had never corrected Vanessa. She had not felt the need. She moved toward the edge of the room and found a chair, sat down and crossed her ankles and folded her hands in her lap. She was still wearing the same dress, the same shoes, the same bag. Nothing about her appearance had changed, but something about her posture had. Across the room, Vanessa was performing for a cluster of people near the bar, gesturing, laughing, reaching up to touch the diamond pendant at her throat. It was a beautiful piece, a teardrop diamond set in platinum, hanging on a chain that caught the light every time she moved. Claire knew that necklace. She had, in fact, paid for it. Not directly, not intentionally, but 8 months ago, when she had discovered the full extent of what she'd suspected for nearly a year. The affair, the financial bleeding, the credit card, she hadn't known existed. She'd traced every transaction, every purchase, every dollar that had left accounts she'd structured to quietly support Ethan's business without his knowledge. The diamond necklace had been charged to one of those accounts 2 weeks after Vanessa entered the picture, $4,400, jeweler on the Upper East Side. The receipt had been easy to find once she knew where to look. She stared at it from across the room and thought, that's mine. Not because she wanted it. She'd never been particularly attached to jewelry. But because the woman wearing it had stood in this lobby 40 minutes ago and squeezed Claire's bag and laughed, and the diamonds sparkling at her throat had been paid for with Claire's money. There was something almost elegant about how completely Vanessa had humiliated herself without knowing it. Ethan had spent the last 7 years believing he was a self-made success story. He had told that story at dinners and panels, and in a profile piece a business magazine had run 18 months ago, she had a copy of it somewhere, the headline reading something like, "The architect who built his dream from nothing." He believed it. She could see it in the way he carried himself, now that particular confidence of a man who had decided his life was proof of his own worth. But every project that had made his name had been quietly rescued when it started to fail. The Meridian Building. The one that got him his first real national press had been 6 weeks from foreclosure when a silent investor stepped in with a cash infusion that saved it. Ethan had told the story of that investor as a lucky break, a stranger who believed in his vision. He didn't know the stranger was a shell company. He didn't know the shell company traced back to Whitmore Capital. He didn't know because Claire had made sure he wouldn't. She'd done it for love. She'd told herself that, and she'd believed it because she had loved him, completely and somewhat foolishly the way people love things they've chosen over everything else, with a conviction that becomes almost indistinguishable from identity after enough years. But she had also, she understood now, done him a profound disservice. She had let him believe he was something he wasn't. She had built the stage and then stood behind the curtain and handed him his lines, and she had watched him perform and told herself this was love. What it actually was, she was less certain of now. Enabling, perhaps, or a particular kind of arrogance, the arrogance of deciding someone needed to be protected from the truth of their own limitations. She had made him into something, and then he had taken that something and walked away from her and taken up with a woman who was all surface and no foundation, and he'd done it thinking he was trading up. She had felt many things about that in the months since: grief, anger, a deep, tired sadness that sat in her chest some mornings and made it difficult to get out of bed. But she had worked through those feelings with a quiet discipline that was, she supposed, very characteristically her. She had not called him. She had not confronted Vanessa. She had not gone to the press or made a scene or done any of the things that the situation seemed to invite. She had been patient. She had waited for the right moment. And now she was sitting in a chair in a hotel her father built, watching a woman in her diamonds. And she thought, here it is, the right moment. It arrived exactly on schedule. Across the room, Vanessa had discovered the bar and was now holding court with 4 people who were laughing at something she'd just said. Her phone was out. She was filming herself. The teardrop diamond caught the light like a small, expensive star. Ethan was standing slightly apart from the group, a drink in his hand, scanning the room with an expression Claire recognized the social anxiety he'd always had, the feeling of being in a room where he might be found out. It was strange to see it now on the face of a man who'd spent years learning to perform confidence. The mask had gotten better. The anxiety underneath it hadn't changed. He looked toward her corner. Their eyes met. For a moment, just a moment, she saw something pass across his face that had nothing to do with guilt or calculation or social performance. Something unguarded. Something that looked almost like the 28-year-old she'd married, the one who'd had so many ideas and so much hunger and so little belief in himself that he'd sometimes wake up at 3 a.m. and just lie there silent, rigid with the fear that none of it would work. She used to put her hand on his chest on those nights. She never said anything, just her hand over his heart until she felt him breathe again. She looked away first, because the elevator doors across the lobby had just opened, and the man who stepped out of them was wearing a dark suit and carrying himself with the quiet, absolute authority of someone who has never needed to announce his presence, because every room he's ever entered has already understood it. Richard Whitmore. He was 71 years old and looked like a man who had built half of Manhattan and intended to build the other half before he was done. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered, a face that had never been handsome in the conventional sense, but had something better, the kind of presence that made handsome irrelevant. He crossed the lobby without hurrying. People moved for him the way water moves for a stone, not dramatically, just naturally, as if the path existed because he was walking it. He reached Claire's chair and looked down at her, and his expression was the one that almost nobody else had ever seen on Richard Whitmore's face, something that was very nearly tender. "You look like your mother," he said. "I always look like my mother," she said. "Yes." He held out his hand. "But tonight, you look like her in a way that means something." She took his hand, stood up, smoothed the front of her $40 navy dress one final time. "Are you ready?" he asked. She looked across the room, at Vanessa laughing at the bar diamonds flashing, at Ethan with his drink, his mask, his 7 years of borrowed success, at the room full of people who had watched a woman get humiliated in a lobby and done nothing, and laughed. "I've been ready," Claire said, "for a long time." Richard nodded once, offered his arm. She took it, and they walked forward together, the daughter who had hidden herself for 7 years, and the father who had waded into a room that was about to understand something it had gotten completely wrong. The event was still 3 hours away. Claire had 3 hours to remember who she was, and she intended to use every single one of them. The problem with becoming invisible is that you start to forget you have edges. You forget that you take up space. You forget that you have a voice that, when used, carries in rooms. You spend enough years at the side of someone else's ambition, and you start to mistake their shape for your own. Start to think that your stillness is smallness, that your patience is passivity, that your silence is absence. Claire Whitmore. And it was Whitmore. It had always been. Whitmore. Carter had only ever been a name she'd borrowed when she was trying to be someone smaller, had made herself invisible by choice. She wanted that on the record even now, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. She had chosen this. No one had forced her hand. She had met Ethan when she was 24, already 2 years out of Wharton, already working quietly inside her father's company, in a role she'd designed to be undetectable. She told her father she wanted to learn the business from the inside without anyone knowing who she was. He'd disagreed. They'd fought about it for 3 months. And then he'd done what Richard Whitmore almost never did. He'd let her have her way. She'd met Ethan at an industry conference she'd attended under her mother's maiden name. He'd been presenting a portfolio of early work, modest projects, ambitious ideas, the energy of someone who hadn't yet learned to edit themselves for the room. She'd liked that. She'd been surrounded her whole life by people who knew exactly how to perform for the room, and here was this man who just talked, just said the thing he thought straight and unpolished and let it sit there. She'd introduced herself. She'd given him her mother's name. She'd told him she worked in real estate consulting. Not untrue, just incomplete. They'd talked for 3 hours over terrible conference center coffee, and by the end of it she'd known 2 things with complete certainty. First, he was genuinely talented, raw and undisciplined, and somewhat reckless in the way ambitious people often are, but talented. Second, she was in trouble. She'd married him 14 months later over her father's vocally expressed reservations. Richard Whitmore had sat across from her in his study and said with the directness she'd inherited from him, "He's chasing something, Claire. People who chase things don't stop when they catch them. They just find something bigger to chase." She'd told him he was wrong. She'd believed that too. But her father, as she was now 7 years later, walking through the lobby of a hotel he'd built on his arm, preparing to become herself again, had as usual been right. The suite he'd arranged was on the 32nd floor. 3 rooms, a sitting room, a bedroom, a wardrobe room that currently contained a garment bag, a hairstylist named Priya, who had worked with Claire for years, and a stylist named Marco, who had brought 3 gown options and strong opinions about each of them. Silver. Marco said the moment she walked in without any preamble whatsoever. He was holding up the first option like he was presenting evidence in a trial. "No question. The others are beautiful, but they're asking the room to notice them. The silver asks nothing. It just exists, and the room adjusts." Priya, who was setting up at the mirror, looked over her shoulder. "He's right." Claire looked at the dress. Silver. Floor length. Structured at the shoulders, fluid everywhere else, the fabric catching light without chasing it. "Fine," she said. "Fine." Marco pressed the garment bag to his chest, like she'd wounded him. "It's beautiful, Marco." She touched his arm briefly. "It's exactly right." He accepted this. "Sit with Priya first. We have time." She sat down in the chair in front of the mirror and looked at herself. The $40 dress, the leather tote on the table beside her, the face that was, as her father had said, her mother's face tonight, the particular stillness her mother had carried, the quality of being present in a room without performing presence. Her mother had died when Claire was 19. Cancer fast and unforgiving over before any of them had fully understood it was beginning. Her mother had been the only person in her life who had ever looked at her and said, "You don't need to be smaller for anyone. Not ever. Promise me." She'd promised. She'd spent the next 12 years breaking that promise in the most elaborate way imaginable. "You okay?" Priya asked quietly, her fingers moving through Claire's hair. "I'm okay," Claire said. And then, because it was Priya, and Priya had known her since she was 22, "I'm nervous." "You don't look nervous." "I know." Priya smiled at her in the mirror. That's actually more frightening than looking nervous." "Good," Claire said. "That's the idea." Outside the suite 32 floors below, Vanessa Cole was laughing at something at the bar and touching the diamond at her throat and having no idea, not the faintest shadow of an idea, that the evening she was currently inhabiting was about to become something else entirely. And Claire sat in front of the mirror while Priya worked, and Marco hung the silver dress and the clock moved forward, and she thought about all the ways a person can be known without being understood. Thought about Ethan sitting in that lobby next to her for 7 years, thinking he saw her thinking the woman he'd married was someone small and quiet who'd been lucky to have him. She thought about the conference, the terrible coffee, the way he'd talked for 3 hours without editing himself. She thought about her father's warning, and she thought, I should have listened. But she hadn't, and here she was. And in 2 hours and 40 minutes, everything, every single thing, was going to change. Not for revenge. She wanted to be clear about that in her own mind, clear and honest. Revenge was for people whose primary emotion was anger, and Claire's primary emotion as she sat in that chair was something colder and more final than anger. It was clarity. The complete, uncomplicated clarity of a person who has finally decided to stop asking for permission to exist. She looked at herself in the mirror, at the face that was her mother's face, at the hands folded in her lap, at the woman who had stood in a lobby 40 minutes ago and let someone squeeze her bag and laugh at her shoes and who had said nothing. And she thought last time, that was the last time. "Ready?" Priya said, stepping back. Claire looked at herself in the mirror, transformed electric herself, and said, "Yes." Marco lifted the silver dress from the garment bag, and downstairs, the gala was just beginning. The elevator doors closed behind Richard Whitmore at exactly 8:47 in the evening. Claire knew because she checked her watch, not out of nervousness, out of habit. She had always been precise about time, about knowing exactly where she was in any given sequence of events, exactly how much runway remained before something became irreversible. Upstairs, Marco was steaming the silver dress. Priya was laying out her kit. The gala formally began at 9. 13 minutes. She used them. She sat in the chair by the window on the 32nd floor and let herself do something she almost never allowed. She went back. Not in the soft, nostalgic way people revisit the past when they miss it. In the clear-eyed, almost clinical way, a person reviews a decision they made with full information and still got wrong. She went back to the beginning, all the way back. Because if she was going to walk into that ballroom tonight and become the woman she'd been hiding for 7 years, she needed to understand completely and without flinching exactly what she had built and who she had built it for. She had met Ethan Carter at a conference in Chicago in October 11 years ago. She was 24. He was 28. He was presenting early work, 2 small commercial projects, and 1 residential concept that was genuinely unlike anything else in the room. It had that quality that real talent always has. It made you feel something before you understood why. She had walked up to him after the presentation and said, "The residential concept, the way you handled the light corridors, that was real." He had looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language he hadn't expected to hear. Most people asked about the commercial stuff. "The commercial stuff was competent," she said. "The residential concept was alive." He had stared at her for a moment. Then he laughed, a real laugh unperformed, surprised out of him. "I'm Ethan." "I know," she said. "I read your bio. I'm Claire." They had talked for 3 hours. The conference dinner happened without them. The networking cocktail hour happened without them. They sat at a corner table in the hotel bar, and he talked about architecture, the way people talk about the thing they love when they're not yet sure they're allowed to love it that much, with a kind of defensive excitement, like he was waiting to be told it was ridiculous. She never told him it was ridiculous. What she did tell him very carefully was almost nothing about herself. Her name was Claire Whitmore. She gave him her mother's maiden name, Holloway. Claire Holloway. She told him she worked in real estate consulting. She told him she was from Connecticut. Both of these things were technically true, and both of them were carefully constructed to point away from everything else. She did not tell him about Wharton. She did not tell him about her father. She did not tell him that she had spent the last 2 years learning her father's business from the inside, moving through departments under a name no one recognized, building a private education in the mechanics of the empire she stood to inherit. She didn't tell him any of that, and he didn't ask. Not because he wasn't curious she could see that he was, but because he was 28 years old and standing in the warm light of a woman who had just told him his work was alive, and he was, she understood much later, a man who had spent most of his life waiting to be seen. She had seen him, and that, as it turned out, had been enough. They were married 14 months later. He proposed in the apartment he was renting in Brooklyn, a third-floor walk-up with bad plumbing and a kitchen window that looked directly into the apartment across the alley. He'd made dinner. He'd bought a ring that was modest and thoughtful and exactly the kind of thing a person chooses when they're being honest about where they are in their life. She had loved that ring more than she could explain. She said yes before he finished the sentence. Her father had not come to the wedding. They had fought about it for 6 weeks leading up to the ceremony, the most sustained, exhausting fight of her life, conducted in his study over 3 separate evenings and through a series of phone calls that left her standing in her kitchen with her forehead against the cabinet door, breathing through it. "You're hiding yourself from him," her father had said on the last evening, with the directness that was his most reliable quality. "You think you're protecting him. You're not. You're protecting yourself." From what? From finding out if he loves the real you. A pause. Because if he doesn't know the real you never have to find out. She had told him he was wrong. She had believed it with the full conviction of a 25-year-old who had made up her mind. But she was standing in this room 11 years later, and her father's words were sitting in her chest with the particular weight of things that were true before you were ready to know it. She had not corrected the story with Ethan. She had told him her family was complicated, that she and her father had a difficult relationship, that she preferred to make her own way. All of this was true enough to feel honest. None of it was complete. And Ethan, hungry, ambitious, privately insecure, Ethan had accepted the story because it suited him, because a wife without a powerful family meant a success that was fully his own, because there was no shadow to stand in if the shadow didn't officially exist. What he hadn't known, what he had never suspected, was what was happening in the dark. His first major project, the Meridian building on the west side, had gone over budget by 30% in the second year. His contractor walked. His bank called the loan. He had come home one night and sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands and said nothing for 40 minutes. Claire had sat across from him. She had made tea. She had waited. "I don't know if I can save it," he finally said. "I don't know if there's a way." "There's always a way," she said. "Sleep. We'll think in the morning." He had slept. She had not. She had gotten up at 2 a.m. and gone to the second bedroom, the one they used as an office, and made 3 phone calls. One to a trust administrator, one to a financial attorney, one to a man who ran a real estate holding company that existed technically on paper and which she controlled through a structure that would take a forensic accountant considerable time to unravel. By morning, a silent investor had expressed interest in the Meridian project. By the end of the week, the loan was restructured and the contractor was back. Ethan never knew. He told the story of the Meridian building for years, the story of the mysterious investor who believed in his vision, the stroke of luck that saved everything, the proof that if you had real talent, the universe eventually sent someone who could see it. He told it at dinners and panels, and eventually in that magazine profile with the headline about being self-made. Each time Claire listened, she said nothing. She told herself it didn't matter who got the credit. She told herself she'd done it for love. The second rescue came 18 months later, a development deal in New Jersey that collapsed when the primary backer pulled out 3 months before groundbreaking. This time it was faster. She'd gotten better at the mechanics of it, quicker at moving pieces without leaving visible trails. The shell company came in with bridge financing. The deal closed. Ethan's firm survived. Then the cars. Then the credit cards. He didn't tell her about the ones he'd opened to maintain the lifestyle that his income, real and impressive on its own terms, couldn't quite sustain at the pace he wanted to sustain it. She found them not by snooping, but by being the person who understood their financial structure completely, who reviewed statements as a matter of course, who noticed when numbers moved in ways they shouldn't. She paid them. Quietly. From accounts he didn't know existed. This was, she understood now, where things had gone wrong in a way that had nothing to do with Vanessa Cole. She had made herself so completely invisible that Ethan had stopped considering her at all. Not cruelly, not deliberately. The way people stop noticing the foundation of a house, not because they don't need it, but because it's always there, because it has never failed, because its presence has become indistinguishable from absence. She had engineered her own irrelevance. And into that irrelevance, approximately 2 years ago, had walked Vanessa Cole. Claire had heard the name first from a mutual acquaintance, a woman named Patricia, who ran in architecture circles and delivered information with the casual precision of someone who understood its value. Patricia had mentioned at a lunch that Ethan had been seen at an opening with someone named Vanessa Cole, an influencer. Very visible, Patricia had paused here, choosing her word, persistent. Claire had gone home and looked Vanessa Cole up online. 4 million followers, lifestyle content, luxury travel, an aesthetic that was expensive and aspirational and entirely constructed for consumption, a face that knew exactly what it was doing in front of a camera. She had closed the browser and sat with it. She had known in that moment with the same clear certainty she'd had about the Meridian Building's collapse, about every financial crisis she'd quietly resolved, that this was something different. This wasn't a contractor walking or a loan being called. This was Ethan standing at an opening with a woman who represented everything he'd always wanted to be adjacent to, everything he'd spent a decade performing for and feeling for the first time, like he was actually in the picture rather than just near it. She had done nothing. Not immediately. She had watched. She had been patient. She had waited to see if it was a moment or a direction. It was a direction. 6 months later, Ethan had sat down across from her at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd put his head in his hands over the Meridian Building and told her that he thought they should separate, that he'd been unhappy for a while, that he felt like they wanted different things, that he cared about her but wasn't in love with her the way he used to be, that he hoped they could be respectful about this. He had not mentioned Vanessa. She had not mentioned Vanessa either. She had looked at him across that table, this man she'd chosen over everything. This man she'd spent 7 years quietly rescuing from himself, and she had thought he has no idea. He is sitting here telling me he's leaving, and he has absolutely no idea what's about to disappear from his life. Not me, not Claire the person, the architecture, the invisible structure, the thing that's been holding all of this up. Okay, she said. He blinked. Okay. If that's what you need. He had seemed surprised. She understood why. He had probably expected tears, an argument, recriminations, the messy emotional accounting of a marriage ending. He had braced for impact and found instead a woman who looked at him calmly across a kitchen table and said, "Okay." "I just want you to be sure," she said. "That's all." "I'm sure," he said. And then, because he was Ethan, and he had always been capable of more feeling than he allowed himself to show, "I'm sorry, Claire. I really am." She had believed him. She still believed him, actually. She thought the apology was genuine, the sorry real, the regret about the wreckage authentic. She didn't think Ethan was a bad man. She thought he was a limited one, a man who had mistaken performance for substance for so long that he'd lost the ability to tell the difference. And Vanessa Cole, all surface and flash and diamond-bright visibility, was the purest possible expression of everything he'd been performing toward. He wanted to be in her world. He didn't understand that the world he'd built or believed he'd built was already hers. The papers had been filed 3 months ago. They were not yet final. The process moved at the pace of legal processes, which was to say, slowly technically with many documents. In the meantime, Ethan had moved in with Vanessa. Or rather, Vanessa had moved into the apartment that Ethan's firm paid for, which was to say, the apartment that Claire's invisible financial engineering had made possible, and they had proceeded to document their life together for 4 million followers, with the relentless, curated intensity of people who need an audience to confirm that what they're doing is real. Claire had not followed them online. She had not needed to. Patricia kept her informed with the efficiency of someone who considered it a civic service. She posted about the apartment, Patricia had said, about 6 weeks after the move. Called it their dream space. He's in the pictures. He looks... Patricia. What? I don't need the details. Right. A pause. The necklace she's always wearing, the diamond one, did he buy her that? Claire had been quiet for a moment. No, she said. I did. Patricia had gone very still on the other end of the phone. I mean, technically, Claire said. Through an account he used for personal expenses. He didn't know it was my money. Claire, Patricia's voice was careful. How much of his life has been your money? She thought about the Meridian building, the New Jersey deal, the credit cards, the apartment lease that had been backstopped by a guarantee she'd arranged through a holding company, the architecture software licenses renewed through a vendor she'd quietly subsidized, the business travel she'd underwritten through a corporate account that technically existed under a name that wasn't his. Enough, she said. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. And he doesn't know. He doesn't know. Another silence. Then, what are you going to do? Claire had looked out the window of the Connecticut house, her house paid for cleanly with her own money, the one thing in the structure that was uncomplicated. I don't know yet, she said. But she had known. She just hadn't been ready to say it. That conversation had been 4 months ago, in the time since she had done 3 things. First, she had called her father. It had been the hardest phone call of her life, harder than sitting across the kitchen table from Ethan, harder than signing the separation agreement, harder than the 6 weeks of fights before her wedding. Because calling her father meant admitting that the 7 years she'd spent proving him wrong had ended in him being right, and Richard Whitmore was not a man who made that easy. He had picked up on the second ring. Claire, I want to come home, she said. A pause. When the time is right. All right. Another pause. Then, and she had not expected this, his voice went quiet and careful, in a way she hadn't heard since her mother's funeral. Are you okay? She had pressed her hand flat against the window glass and felt the cold of it against her palm. No, she said. Not yet. Okay, he said. Okay, come home when you're ready. I'll be here. She had not cried during that call. She had cried for approximately 45 minutes after it ended alone in the kitchen of the Connecticut house, sitting on the floor with her back against the cabinet, which was not elegant or composed or any of the things she generally was, but which was completely necessary and which she had allowed herself without apology. Then she had washed her face, made tea, and moved to the second thing. She had commissioned a complete financial audit through a firm her father used. People she trusted absolutely of every structure she had built around Ethan's business over 7 years. Every shell company, every guarantee, every silent investment, every account. The audit had taken 6 weeks. The report was 240 pages long. She had read all of it. The number, the total cumulative amount, she had moved through invisible channels to support Ethan Carter's career and lifestyle over 7 years, was significant enough that when the auditor presented it to her, he had done so with the careful, neutral professionalism of a man who understood that the number required a particular kind of delivery. She had looked at it, nodded, said thank you, shaken his hand. In the car on the way home, she had sat very still and thought I loved him that much. I loved him enough to do all of that, and he left me for a woman who films herself at brunch. It wasn't bitterness exactly. It was something more bewildering than bitterness. It was the particular vertigo of a person looking at the full scale of their own choices for the first time. Then she had done the third thing. She had called the CEO of Whitmore Global, her father's chief executive, a woman named Sandra Okafor, whom Claire had known since she was 19, and who had over the course of many years watched and waited with a patience that matched Richard Whitmore's own, and she had said, I'm ready to come back, officially this time. Sandra had been quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then she had said, it's about time, and the warmth in her voice was so complete that Claire had to press her lips together for a moment before she could respond. The announcement had been in preparation for 3 months. The gala tonight was the venue. The timing was Richard's idea, and it was, she had to admit, exactly the kind of thing her father would engineer. Not cruel, not orchestrated for spectacle, but inevitable. He had built this building. He ran this foundation. The annual gala had always been where Whitmore Global made its major announcements. There was nothing unusual about the decision, nothing that could be called calculated, except that he had known Ethan would be here. He had known because Ethan had spent months trying to secure a meeting with Whitmore Global's real estate division, pursuing the account with the desperate energy of a man who had recently lost his invisible safety net and didn't yet know it. He had been invited as a prospective vendor contact, a minor guest, someone seated near the kitchen entrance with 50 other peripheral attendees. Her father had said nothing about this to Claire. He had not needed to. "You knew he'd be here," she had said when he met her in the lobby. "Yes," Richard said, "and you invited him anyway." "I didn't invite him. Sandra's team manages the vendor invitations. I may have not specifically flagged that he should be excluded." A pause. Minor distinction. "Dad, the building is mine, Claire. The gala is mine. My daughter is being announced as the future CEO of my company. If Ethan Carter happens to be seated near the kitchen when that happens, I don't consider that my responsibility." She had looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her with the particular expression of a man who has been right for 7 years and has chosen with great discipline not to say so. "Fine," she said. "Fine," he agreed. And then the corner of his mouth moved very slightly. "You look like your mother." The clock on the suite wall read 8:59, 1 minute. She stood up from the chair. Marco crossed to her with the silver dress, and she stepped into it, and Priya made the final adjustments to her hair, and for a moment the three of them were still just a moment, just a breath, and Claire looked at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was not Claire Carter. Claire Carter had been quiet and careful and invisible, and had poured 7 years of herself into a foundation that someone else had stood on and walked away from. The woman in the mirror was Claire Whitmore, and she had been waiting with extraordinary patience for exactly this moment. "Ready?" Priya said. Claire straightened. "Yes." She walked to the door, opened it. And somewhere below her in the ballroom that her father built, Ethan Carter was shaking hands with men he needed, and Vanessa Cole was filming herself at the bar, fingers at the diamond necklace at her throat, performing a life that was about to come apart at every seam. Neither of them had any idea. Neither of them had even thought to wonder. And that Claire thought as the elevator doors opened and she stepped inside was perhaps the saddest thing of all. Not what was coming, but how completely unprepared they were for it. Not because she'd hidden it well, but because they had never not once thought to look. The elevator descended, 32 floors, 31, 30. Somewhere below her, a room full of New York's most powerful people were finishing their first course and beginning the kind of conversations that moved money and shaped cities. And the woman who was about to walk among them, the woman they were about to meet for the first time, though she had been in the room all along, stood in the elevator and breathed slowly and completely, and let herself arrive. The doors opened at the lobby level. She stepped out, and the gala at last truly began. The elevator doors opened at 9:14. Nobody noticed at first. That was the thing about grand entrances. The real ones, the ones that actually mattered, never announced themselves. The room was loud, full humming with the particular energy of wealthy people performing ease for each other. Crystal clinked. Conversations overlapped. A quartet played something classical near the east wall that nobody was listening to. Claire stepped out of the elevator and into the lobby corridor, and for approximately 30 seconds, the world continued exactly as it had been. Then Patricia saw her. Patricia, who was standing near the corridor entrance with a glass of white wine and the alert social awareness of a woman who had spent 30 years in these rooms, went completely still. Her wine stopped halfway to her mouth. Her eyes traveled from Claire's face to the silver gown to the way she was walking. Not the careful peripheral walk of the woman who'd stood in a corner an hour ago, but something else entirely. Something that occupied space. "My God," Patricia said to no one in particular. The woman beside her turned to look. Then the woman beside her. It moved outward in that quiet ripple, not a gasp, not a commotion, just a gradual reorientation of attention, the way a room full of people shifts when something real enters it. Claire did not slow down. She did not look for reactions. She moved through the corridor toward the main ballroom entrance with the unhurried certainty of someone who knows exactly where they're going because they've always known, because the destination was never in question, only the timing. Richard Whitmore was waiting at the ballroom entrance. He saw her coming, and something in his face that controlled formidable face, that had looked the same across boardroom tables for 4 decades, shifted into something private and complete. He stood a little straighter. He held out his arm. She took it. "Ready," he said for the second time that evening. "Stop asking me that," she said. He almost smiled. "Fair enough." They walked in together. The ballroom was at capacity, 300 guests arranged across 20 tables, the room lit at that specific luxury event temperature. Warm without being soft, designed to make everything look slightly more significant than it was. Whitmore Foundation galas attracted a particular class of guest, the people who didn't need to network because they'd already networked, who came because being here was its own statement, who understood without being told that attendance was a form of currency. These were people who knew Richard Whitmore's face, who understood what it meant when he walked into a room, who paid attention professionally and instinctively to where he moved and who he moved with. So when Richard Whitmore entered his own gala with a woman none of them recognized, a woman in silver, who matched his bearing, who moved beside him like she'd been doing it all her life, which she had, the room did not erupt. It tilted. Quietly, collectively, it tilted toward them and began the rapid social calculation of who she was. At table 4, a hedge fund manager leaned toward his wife and said quietly, "Who is that with Richard?" His wife, who paid closer attention to these things, said, "I have no idea, but look at the way he's walking." At table 11, a city councilwoman touched her husband's arm without looking away. At the bar, Vanessa Cole was mid-sentence. Something about a brand deal, something about follower counts. When she registered the shift in the room's attention, she turned, following everyone else's gaze toward the entrance, and saw a woman in silver standing beside Richard Whitmore. Her sentence stopped. "Who is that?" she asked. The man beside her shook his head. "Don't know." Vanessa squinted. Then something crossed her face, a flicker of recognition, not of identity, but of silhouette, something about the posture that nagged at her. But she dismissed it, because the woman she was looking at was wearing a gown that cost more than most people's rent, and standing beside one of the most powerful men in the country. And that woman could not possibly be Ethan. She grabbed his arm. "Ethan, look!" He turned and went still. He knew. He knew immediately and completely the way you know things about people you've shared a life with, the knowledge that lives below conscious thought and arrives faster than logic. He looked at the woman in the silver gown beside Richard Whitmore, and his body understood before his mind caught up. "That's," he started. "No," Vanessa said, flat, certain. "No, that's not her." "Vanessa. That is not your ex-wife. That woman is standing next to Richard Whitmore. Your ex-wife takes the subway." She turned back to her drink. "You need glasses." Ethan said nothing. He kept looking. And Claire, who had not looked toward the bar, who had not scanned the room for Ethan or Vanessa or any of the 100 people she might have looked for instead, moved with her father toward the front of the room, toward the table where Sandra Okafor was waiting, where the Whitmore Global board members were seated, where she had a place that had been set for her, with a name card that read, for the first time in 7 years, her real name, Claire Whitmore. She saw it when she reached the table, picked up the card, ran her thumb across the letters. Sandra stood and embraced her, the warmth of it, immediate and uncomplicated. "You look extraordinary," Sandra said in her ear. "I look like myself," Claire said. "Yes," Sandra said, pulling back to look at her. "That's what I said." They sat. The first course was already cleared. The second was being served. Around them, conversations resumed, but with a different frequency, now an undercurrent of curiosity, of recalibration, of the social machinery of a room like this, processing new information. At 9:22, the woman at the table to Claire's left, the wife of a real estate developer, a woman named Helen, who had attended these galas for 15 years, leaned slightly toward Claire and said with careful casualness, "I don't believe we've met. Helen Marsh." "Claire Whitmore," Claire said. Helen Marsh's expression did approximately 4 things in very quick succession: recognition, recalculation, surprise, recovery, before settling on gracious warmth. "Richard's daughter," she said. "Of course, I should have seen it immediately. You have his—" She paused, searching. "You have his way of sitting in a room." "His words exactly," Richard said from Claire's other side without looking up from his menu. Helen Marsh laughed genuinely. "Richard, you might have warned people." "Why?" He looked up. "People should pay attention." The table within earshot absorbed this, and the recalibration continued. At 9:31, the situation at table 17 had deteriorated. Vanessa had figured it out. Not all at once. In pieces, the way unpleasant truths tend to arrive, first a detail that doesn't fit, then another, then the sudden terrible coherence of all of them together. She had looked at the silver woman at the front table one too many times, studied the profile one too many times, and something about the hands, the way Claire held a fork, a completely specific and unremarkable personal gesture, had broken through the denial. "Ethan," she said. Her voice was different now. "Is that her?" He had been nursing his drink for the last 15 minutes and saying very little. He looked at Vanessa, then toward the front of the room, then back at Vanessa. "Yes," he said. The silence between them was extremely loud. "She's sitting with Richard Whitmore," Vanessa said. "Yes." "At his table." "Yes." Vanessa set down her fork. "Why is she sitting at Richard Whitmore's table?" Ethan said nothing, because he was in that moment doing the same arithmetic Vanessa was doing, but he'd been given a head start of 11 years of marriage to a woman he now understood with a cold and spreading certainty he had never actually known. "Ethan," Vanessa's voice was very quiet now, which was more alarming than loud. "Why does your ex-wife know Richard Whitmore?" "I don't—" He stopped. "I'm not sure." "You're not sure?" She picked up her wine, put it down. "You've been married to this woman for 7 years, and you're not sure why she's sitting at the table of the man who owns this building." He ran his hand over his face. "She never talked about her family." "What?" "She said they were estranged, that she preferred—" He stopped again, because he was hearing his own words and they were sounding in this new light exactly like what they had always been. The explanation of a man who hadn't asked enough questions because the answers hadn't mattered enough to him to pursue. Vanessa stared at him. Something moved across her face, not just anger, not just confusion, but the beginning of something that felt like fear. "Ethan, what did you know about her family?" "Nothing," he said. "I thought I knew everything about her, and I knew nothing." He said it quietly, without drama, the way people say true things when the truth has finally arrived and there's no point in cushioning it. "I never asked." Vanessa sat with that for a moment. Then she pushed back from the table. "I need to speak to her." "Vanessa," his hand on her arm. "Don't. I humiliated her in this lobby." Her voice had shifted into something that was part anger and part something else, something that might in a different person have been described as conscience. "In front of everyone. I poured champagne on her shoes and I called her—" She stopped, and she just stood there. She said tonight was going to be useful. The word landed differently now. "Why did she say that—" "Vanessa, don't—" She shook him off and stood up. At the front of the room, Sandra Okafor leaned toward Richard Whitmore and said quietly, "The woman from the bar is moving." Richard didn't turn around. "I see her." Claire had not turned around either. She was in a conversation with Helen Marsh about a community housing initiative, and the conversation was genuine and engaged, and she did not stop it. She was aware with her peripheral attention of the movement at the back of the room. She was aware of Vanessa approaching. She finished her sentence to Helen Marsh, and then only then turned. Vanessa Cole arrived at the Whitmore table looking for the first time in Claire's experience of her slightly undone. The performance was still there, the posture, the diamonds, the carefully composed expression, but there were cracks in it, small ones, the kind only another woman would notice. "I need to talk to you," Vanessa said. Not loud, almost private. "All right," Claire said. She didn't stand up. She didn't move to make it easier. She simply looked at Vanessa and waited. The people at the surrounding tables were listening, not obviously, but listening. "Are you—" Vanessa stopped, tried again. "Are you Richard Whitmore's daughter?" "Yes," Claire said. The silence that followed that single syllable was extraordinary. Not just at the table, around it. The radius of quiet expanded outward as the word traveled, as people who had been half listening became fully listening, as the social calculation of the room revised itself at speed. Vanessa's face did something complicated. The arrogance cracked. Underneath it was something raw, something that looked almost like a person realizing they have made a catastrophic miscalculation in a game they thought they were winning. "You never told him," Vanessa said, not an accusation. Almost a statement of fact, delivered with a kind of bewildered disbelief. "No," Claire said. "Why?" Claire looked at her for a moment, really looked at her, at the diamond at her throat, which cost $4,400 from a jeweler on the Upper East Side, and had been charged to an account Claire controlled at the woman underneath the performance, who was 29 years old, and had until approximately 11 minutes ago believed she was in the winning position. "Because it wasn't his to know," Claire said. "Not the way he would have used it." Vanessa stared at her. "That necklace?" she said. Her hand went to her throat. "He bought me this necklace 8 months ago." "He charged it," Claire said, "to an expense account connected to a holding company I controlled. The transaction is in a financial report currently sitting in my father's office." A pause. "It's mine, Vanessa, technically." Vanessa's hand dropped from her throat. Helen Marsh, to Claire's left, was no longer pretending not to listen. "I don't want it back," Claire said. "Keep it. Consider it the last thing I paid for." Vanessa stood there for a moment longer. And then, and this was the thing Claire had not predicted, the thing she would think about later. Vanessa's eyes went bright, not with anger, with something that was very close to humiliation. Real humiliation, the kind that lives underneath the performance, the kind that arrives when a person understands not just that they've lost, but how they've been positioned from the beginning. She turned and walked back to table 17 without another word. The room exhaled. Richard Whitmore, who had watched the entire exchange without expression, said to his daughter very quietly, "Well handled." "She's not the villain of this story," Claire said, equally quiet. "She's just the person who didn't know either." Her father looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, in the particular way he nodded when she'd said something that surprised him into agreement. At table 17, Vanessa sat down across from Ethan and said nothing. She picked up her wine. "Put it down." She touched the diamond at her throat once and then moved her hand away. "Well," Ethan said. "She owns it," Vanessa said. "The necklace, it's technically hers." Her voice was flat and very controlled. "Your ex-wife paid for my necklace, with money that ran through one of her companies, while you were buying it for me to impress me." She looked at him. "Do you understand what that means?" He did. He understood it perfectly. He sat very still with the understanding. "How much," he said finally. "How much of it was her?" Vanessa shook her head. "I don't know, but I think the question you should be asking is how much of it was you." He had no answer for that. At 9:47, the room was called to attention. The host, a polished man who ran these events with the practiced ease of someone who had emceed 100 of them, took the small stage at the front of the ballroom, and the room settled into attentive silence. "Good evening. On behalf of the Whitmore Foundation, thank you for joining us for what will be, I think, a memorable evening." He smiled. "Richard Whitmore has asked me to dispense with the preamble, so I'll oblige him." A ripple of knowing laughter through the room. "Tonight marks a significant moment in the history of Whitmore Global, an announcement that Richard has described to me as, and I quote, long overdue." Another smile. "It is my great honor to introduce, for the first time in this capacity, the incoming Chief Executive Officer of Whitmore Global Properties, Miss Claire Whitmore." The room erupted, not politely, not with the restrained applause of people performing approval. It erupted with genuine energy, the sound of 300 people who understood what Whitmore Global meant, who understood what it meant for Richard Whitmore's daughter to step into that role, who understood that the industry they all operated in had just shifted. Richard stood. He helped Claire to her feet with a simple gesture, offered his arm, and they walked to the stage together. She heard the applause around her, like something at a distance present, but not overwhelming because she was concentrating on putting one foot in front of the other with exactly the right weight, the right pace, the right everything. She had imagined this moment in various forms over the past 3 months, and none of the imagined versions had quite captured this, the warmth of it, the strange intimacy of 300 people seeing you clearly, the feeling of being recognized by a room after years of deliberate invisibility. She reached the stage. She turned to face them. She found, without meaning, to Ethan Carter in the back third of the room. He was standing, everyone was standing, and he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face in 11 years of knowing him. Not surprise, not calculation, something that was entirely without defense, something open and unguarded and devastated in the way that people are devastated not by cruelty, but by the sudden complete understanding of their own mistakes. She looked away. She looked at the room, at the 300 people who were applauding her, at her father standing beside her, with his hand at the small of her back. The same gesture he'd used when she was 7 years old and nervous about the school play, which felt like something, though she wasn't ready to examine what. She leaned toward the microphone. "Thank you," she said. The room quieted. The room. "I want to tell you a story," she said. "It's a short one. 7 years ago, I made a decision to be invisible. I believed at the time that this was wisdom, that the quiet life, the private life, the life without the weight of a name like Whitmore was the real life, the honest one." She paused. "I was wrong. Not about the quiet. The quiet is real, but invisibility isn't the same as honesty. I was hiding, and the things you hide have a way of becoming the things that hold you back." The room was very still. "Whitmore Global has operated for 40 years on a principle my father established before I was born, that what you build should outlast you, that the structures you create in steel and concrete in financial architecture should be strong enough to bear weight that hasn't arrived yet, weight you can't predict, people you haven't met." She looked out at them. "I intend to build on that principle, not to inherit it, to earn it." She stepped back from the microphone. The applause came again, warmer this time, more complete. And in that moment, in that specific crystalline moment, a screen at the back of the stage illuminated. Sandra Okafor had arranged it. Claire had approved it 3 days ago, and then largely not thought about it, and now it was here, and it was more complete than she'd anticipated, because the screen showed numbers, not as an accusation, as a record. The Meridian Building rescue, the New Jersey Bridge financing, the credit facilities, the expense accounts, the shell companies traced back to Whitmore Capital item by item, year by year, the full 7-year architectural record of an invisible hand holding up a career that had believed itself self-made. The total. The room read it in silence. Someone near the front said under their breath, "My God." At table 17, Ethan Carter looked at the screen and did not move for a very long time. Beside him, Vanessa had gone completely still, her wine untouched, the diamond at her throat, very quiet. Claire did not look at the screen. She had read it in the report. She knew every number. She didn't need to look. "Whitmore Global," she said into the microphone, "has acquired Carter Architecture Group effective as of close of business today." The room absorbed this. "Effective immediately, the firm will be restructured under Whitmore Development's commercial division." A pause. "Current executive leadership has been notified." This was not entirely true. Ethan had not been notified. He was being notified now, in this room in front of these people, which was not something Claire had planned for cruelty. It had simply been the cleanest way to do it. Sandra had advised her that notifying him privately first would give him opportunity to take actions that would complicate the transition. She had agreed with that assessment. She had made the call. She watched him receive it from across the room, watched him understand, watched the particular collapse of a person who has just been shown completely and publicly the ground beneath their feet. He didn't stand up. He didn't make a scene. He sat very still with his drink and looked at the screen and looked at Claire and looked somewhere in the middle distance where the full accounting of his life was waiting. Vanessa stood up. She walked toward this exit without looking at anyone, without the phone out, without the performance. She moved through the room with her head down and her hand at her throat, and security, 2 men who had been positioned by the exit at Sandra's instruction, because Sandra thought of everything moved toward her not aggressively, but with the clear intention of accompanying her out. The room watched her go, not with cruelty, with the quiet collective witness of people observing a consequence. At the door she turned, just once. She looked back across the room at Claire on the stage, and there was something in her expression that was not anger and not defiance, and was possibly the most honest thing Vanessa Cole had shown in the entire evening. Then she was gone. Ethan stood up 2 minutes later. He made it about 12 feet toward the exit before a man from Whitmore's legal team appeared beside him with a quiet professional word about the transition documentation that would require his signature and the timeline and the procedure and all of the exact technical unglamorous details of a consequence arriving in real time. Ethan listened, nodded once, twice. His face was controlled and colorless. He walked with the legal team toward a side room away from the main floor, and the door closed behind them. Claire watched him go. She felt looking at the door that had closed behind him, something she had not expected to feel in this moment, a clean, uncomplicated sadness. Not for herself, for him. For the version of him she'd met at that conference table over terrible coffee, the one who talked for 3 hours without editing himself, the one who had been genuinely alive with talent and hunger and the particular fragility of someone who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of their own ambition. That man had existed. She had loved that man. That was real. What he'd become was also real. And the two things could be true simultaneously. The love real, the ending necessary, the sadness legitimate, the action, right? She turned back to the microphone. "Thank you," she said again to the room. "Now, I believe there's dessert." The laughter that came back was warm and real and completely unexpected, and it broke the tension in the room like a window opening. Richard Whitmore, standing beside her, made a sound that took her a moment to identify. He was laughing too. And Claire Whitmore, not Carter, not Holloway, not any of the smaller names she'd tried on over 7 years of making herself fit into spaces that were never built for her, stood on the stage her father had built and let herself take up the space she'd always been entitled to. Fully, finally, without apology. The side room they put Ethan in was small and quiet and entirely without mercy. Not because anyone designed it that way. It was simply a meeting room, a table, 6 chairs, a pitcher of water nobody touched. But mercy requires a certain amount of ambiguity, a gap between what happened and what it means. And in that room at 10:17 in the evening, there was no gap left. The Whitmore legal team had closed every one of them with the clean technical efficiency of people who had been preparing this paperwork for 3 months. Ethan sat at the table with a pen in his hand and did not sign anything for a very long time. The attorney across from him, a woman named Carol Way, precise and not unkind, waited. She had done this before. She understood that some people needed a moment between understanding a thing and accepting it. "Walk me through it again," Ethan said. His voice was controlled, barely. "Carter Architecture Group was acquired by Whitmore Global Development at close of business today," Carol said. "The acquisition was structured through a purchase agreement that your firm's existing silent investor, Whitmore Capital Holdings, was entitled to execute under the terms of the original investment agreements. Agreements that were signed by your business attorney 7 years ago." "I never saw those agreements." "Your attorney signed on your behalf under a standard authority of representation clause." A pause. "Mr. Carter, this is not unusual in silent investment structures. The terms were disclosed to your legal representative." "My attorney never told me." Carol looked at him with careful neutrality. "That would be a conversation to have with your attorney." He set the pen down, picked up the water glass, put it down without drinking. "How long has Whitmore Capital been involved with my firm?" 7 years, Carol said. "From the beginning." "From the Meridian building, yes. That was the first intervention." The word intervention landed like a stone in still water. "Intervention," he repeated. "Investment," Carol said, correcting herself with precision that suggested the first word had been chosen deliberately, and the correction was professional courtesy. He was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the muffled sound of the gala continued, the clink of dishes, the low wave of conversation, the distant sound of a room continuing normally, while his life was reorganized on a table in front of him. "The magazine piece," he said, "the one from 2 years ago, the self-made profile." Carol said nothing. Was any of it real? He wasn't asking her. He was asking the room. He was asking the version of himself that had sat across from a journalist 18 months ago and talked about grit and vision and the mysterious investor who'd believed in him when nobody else did. Was any of it actually me? Carol folded her hands. Mr. Carter, the architectural work was yours. The designs, the client relationships, the professional reputation you built, those were real. But the platform was hers. The financial infrastructure that supported the firm during its vulnerable periods was structured through Whitmore Capital, yes. He picked up the pen, looked at it. What happens to my staff? This was the first question he'd asked that wasn't about himself, and Carol's expression shifted very slightly in acknowledgement of it. Whitmore Development has committed to retaining all current staff for a minimum of 12 months. Salaries are guaranteed. Benefits continue. She slid a document across the table. It's in the agreement. Page 9. He found page 9, read it, nodded. He signed the first document at 10:31, the second at 10:33. The third, the one that terminated his role as executive director, effective immediately, he held for nearly 2 minutes. Carol waited. She was good at waiting. He signed it. He capped the pen, set it on the table, and sat there with his hands flat on the surface in front of him, very still, like a man trying to locate his own center of gravity. Is there anything else? He said. No, Carol said. We'll be in touch about the transition timeline. You'll have access to your office for 30 days to collect personal items. She gathered the documents. Mr. Carter. She paused, which was not part of the standard procedure. For what it's worth, the Meridian building won a design award 3 years ago. That was real, too. He looked at her. She nodded once and left. He sat alone in the small meeting room for 7 minutes, he knew, because he watched the clock on the wall, the way people focus on irrelevant specifics when the relevant ones are too large to process. 7 minutes. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked back out into the world that had reorganized itself without asking his permission. The gala was winding down. Guests were in the departure phase, the handshakes and coat retrievals and promises to connect that marked the end of these events. Ethan moved through it like a man walking through water, everything slightly slower and more resistant than it should have been. He was looking for Vanessa. She was not in the main ballroom, not at the bar, not in the lobby. He found her outside, standing on the sidewalk in front of the hotel, with her phone in her hand, and her coat pulled around her, and the diamond necklace at her throat, catching the light from the entrance canopy. She looked up when she heard him. Something moved across her face, not relief, not anger, something more complicated than either. Well, she said. It's done, he said. The firm is theirs. She absorbed this. Your job, gone. She looked down at her phone, back up at him. The necklace she said she paid for. I looked it up in the charge history on the account you used. She was right. Ethan, she stopped. How much of our life was her money? He had been dreading this question because he had spent the last 40 minutes calculating the answer, and the answer was not something he was ready to say out loud. A lot of it, he said. How much is a lot? The apartment, the firm, the cars, the... He stopped, ran his hand through his hair. The credit cards I didn't tell you about. All of it was backed by accounts that traced back to her family. He looked at Vanessa. I didn't know. I want you to understand that. I genuinely didn't know. Vanessa stared at him for a long moment. The performance was completely gone now. No phone out, no angle, just a 29-year-old woman standing on a sidewalk processing the information that the life she'd been posting about for 8 months had been in significant part funded by the woman she'd publicly humiliated 3 hours ago. The apartment, she said. The lease was guaranteed through a holding company, Whitmore Capital. So when we... She stopped. When I moved in, when I put my things there and filmed the tour and posted it for 4 million people, that was her apartment. He said nothing because there was nothing accurate to say that would make this better. Vanessa made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but lived somewhere in the difficult territory between them. She pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment, then she dropped it. I called her a charity case, she said. In front of everyone, I told her to go home and iron something. I poured... She stopped again. I know. I poured champagne on her shoes, Ethan. The full weight of it arrived at her voice. In her father's building, while wearing a necklace she paid for. He had no response to that. He stood on the sidewalk beside her and let the silence sit, because it deserved to sit. A cab pulled up. Vanessa looked at it, then at him. I need to think, she said. Okay. Alone. He nodded. She got in the cab. The door closed. He watched it pull away into the stream of Fifth Avenue traffic, the red taillights disappearing, and he stood there on the sidewalk outside the Whitmore Grand Hotel and felt the specific cold of a November night in New York, and the much more specific cold of a life that has just been shown to you in its actual dimensions for the first time. He stood there for a while, then he walked to the subway. Because the car, the black Audi he'd driven to the gala, had been a lease backed by Whitmore Capital, and he'd received a text from the leasing company at 10:48 informing him that the account associated with the vehicle had been closed and requesting that he make arrangements to return it at his earliest convenience. So he walked to the subway, for the first time in 4 years, and the city, which cared nothing about any of this, moved around him in its usual indifferent abundance. What happened in the days that followed moved faster than Ethan could track and slower than Vanessa could survive. The story broke online at 6:47 the following morning, posted by a gossip account that had a source inside the gala, someone who had photographed the financial summary on the screen, someone who had captured the moment the acquisition was announced, someone who had filmed Vanessa's walk to the exit with her hand at her throat and Ethan's departure to the side room, and packaged all of it into a 12-minute video that had by 7:30 in the morning been viewed 200,000 times. By noon, it was 2 million. By the following morning, it was 11. The headline that got the most traction read, "Influencer humiliated billionaire's daughter at her own dad's hotel wearing a necklace the daughter paid for." It was not the most elegant headline ever written. It was extremely effective. Vanessa's phone started going at 6:50. It didn't stop. Her manager called first, then her publicist, then both simultaneously, which she understood was not a good sign because her manager and publicist had a professional relationship characterized by mutual avoidance, and they only coordinated when the situation was too large for one of them alone. "We need to get ahead of this," her publicist said. His name was Derek, and he had navigated worse, or believed he had, though he was revising that belief in real time. A statement, acknowledging the situation, expressing what? Vanessa said. Remorse, Derek said. Regret, something that, "I humiliated a woman in her father's building while wearing a necklace she paid for, and then the entire financial history of the relationship I used to humiliate her was displayed on a screen in front of 300 people, Vanessa said. Her voice was flat and precise. What statement covers that, Derek? Derek was quiet for a moment. It's going to be a difficult news cycle, he said. How long? Weeks minimum. Possibly. He stopped. Possibly what? Possibly the kind of thing that changes the shape of a career, he said carefully. She ended the call. She sat in Ethan's apartment. Her apartment. She had thought of it as hers. She had decorated it and filmed it and called it theirs, and now understood it had always been a Whitmore property, and watched her follower count in real time as it moved in a direction follower counts almost never moved. Down. Not slowly. In chunks. 5,000, 8,000, 12,000. The particular velocity of a public cancellation in the social media era, where the audience that built you can unbuild you over breakfast. By the end of the first day, she had lost 240,000 followers. By the end of the second, the first brand pulled their partnership. An email, professional, regretful, citing a need to reassess alignment with their brand values. She understood the language. She had used similar language herself when dropping partnerships that became inconvenient. By the end of the first week, 4 brands had pulled out. The fifth, a jewelry company, which was almost too specific to be accidental, sent a certified letter terminating their contract and requesting the return of all product loans. She stared at the certified letter for a long time. Then she called her mother in Ohio, which was not something she did often, which was something she had been meaning to do more of, which was something she kept not doing because her mother lived in a small house in Dayton and had opinions about social media that Vanessa had previously found exhausting. Her mother picked up on the third ring. "I've seen it." her mother said before Vanessa could speak. "Mom, I've been watching it all morning. Your aunt sent me the video." A pause. "Vanessa, that woman's shoes." "I know." "You poured?" "I know, Mom." Silence. Then her mother said something Vanessa hadn't heard her say in approximately 6 years, said it with the particular gentleness of a woman who has been waiting for her daughter to need her for a long time. "Come home for a little while, just for a few days." Vanessa pressed her hand over her eyes. "I have things here to deal with." "There will always be things. Come home." She did not go home that week. She went home 3 weeks later after the apartment lease was formally transferred back to the Whitmore Property Management Company, and she needed to find somewhere to go. She packed 4 suitcases, left a great deal of furniture she could no longer afford to move, and flew to Dayton on a Tuesday afternoon on a middle seat she'd booked at the last minute because the window seats were $40 more, and she was for the first time in 4 years genuinely thinking about $40. Her mother met her at the airport, hugged her for a long time without saying anything. Vanessa cried in the car, not prettily, not in the filtered, faintly performative way she'd teared up in emotional posts about gratitude and growth. She cried the way people cry when they're not being watched, which was a way she'd almost forgotten. Her mother drove and said nothing and handed her a takeout napkin from the glove compartment. When they pulled into the driveway of the small house in Dayton that Vanessa had spent 10 years trying to get far enough away from her mother, turned off the engine and said, "You're going to be okay." "You don't know that." "I do," her mother said, "because I raised you, and under everything else you're a good person who made bad choices. That's fixable." A pause. "The other way around is much harder." Vanessa sat with that. Then she got out of the car and carried her own suitcases inside. Ethan's fall was less dramatic in its staging and more complete in its substance. He had moved out of the apartment before the lease transfer took what was his, which was less than he'd thought, which was a theme. He rented a room in a shared apartment in Astoria from a woman named Gloria, who charged $1,400 a month and had strict policies about dishes in the sink. He understood the policies. He respected them. He was grateful in a way that surprised him for the clarity of rules that small. His professional situation was more complicated. He had spent 4 years building a reputation in New York architecture circles, and reputations in professional circles are durable things. They survive ordinary setbacks, survive disputes, survive a certain amount of personal drama. What they are less good at surviving is the public revelation that your entire career was secretly underwritten by the wife you left. Not because people hated him for it. Most of them just felt awkward. The calls stopped coming. The invitations dried up. The casual professional relationships that had felt solid turned out to be built on a foundation of his perceived status. And perceived status, he was learning, was exactly as stable as the word perceived suggested. He had savings. 6 months' worth, approximately, if he was careful. He was careful. He made a budget, which was something he had not done in 4 years because budgets had not seemed necessary. He stopped ordering delivery. He started cooking badly at first and then better. He took the subway everywhere. He called his sister in Pittsburgh twice a week because she was the only person in his life who talked to him the same way before and after, who did not perform either sympathy or judgment, who simply spoke to him like he was her brother, which he was, which it turned out was enough. "Are you okay?" she asked on one of those calls, 3 weeks after the gala. "I'm getting there," he said. "That's not the same as yes." "No," he agreed, "it's not." "What happened to this talent?" she said. "The actual work, the buildings." "That's still here." "So use it," she said. "Without the other stuff, without the cars and the events and the Ethan. You were designing buildings when you were 22 on a student loan and you were happy. Do you remember that?" He did. He remembered it with a clarity that was almost painful. The small drafting table, the software he'd pirated, the terrible apartment, the absolute consuming joy of solving a spatial problem on paper. The way a building would click into coherence in his mind like a lock turning. "Yes," he said, "I remember." "Go back to that," she said. "Everything else is noise." He found a job 12 weeks after the gala. Not at a prestige firm, not the kind of position that made it into industry profiles. A mid-sized practice in Long Island City that did good solid work schools, community centers, affordable housing developments. the kind of work he had quietly considered beneath him for the last 5 years. The interview was 30 minutes. The interviewer was a man named Charles who was 63 years old and had been doing this specific kind of work for 4 decades, and who looked at Ethan's portfolio with the careful attention of someone who knew what he was looking for, and said at the end, "The Meridian Building, that residential concept on the 4th floor. Who did that?" "I did," Ethan said. Charles nodded slowly. "That's real work. Why do you want to be here?" Ethan thought about it. Really thought about it, instead of reaching for the polished answer he would have given 18 months ago. "Because I need to do real work," he said, "and I think I forgot what that meant for a while." Charles studied him for a moment. "You'll start at $62,000. It was less than a third of what he'd been making. "Okay," Ethan said. He started the following Monday. The work was hard and specific, and largely unrecognized by the world he'd spent years trying to impress. He designed community spaces. He revised load-bearing calculations. He argued with contractors about window placements in ways that had nothing to do with aesthetics and everything to do with how much light a classroom would receive at 3 in the afternoon in November. He was good at it. He had always been good at it. He had just been pointing it in the wrong direction. But the thing that lived with him, the thing that didn't resolve the way professional redemption somewhat resolved the thing that sat with him in the Astoria apartment and on the subway and in the small kitchen where he cooked badly and then better, was not professional. It was Claire. Not as a wound, not as guilt exactly, though guilt was present. Something more fundamental, something that had arrived on the night of the gala when he'd watched her on that stage and had not left since. He had known her for 11 years. He had been married to her for 7. He had sat across the kitchen table from her in Connecticut on hundreds of ordinary nights, had traveled with her, had watched her read and cook and navigate social situations with the particular quiet intelligence that was entirely her own. And he had not known her. He had thought he had. He had constructed a version of her in his mind, the quiet wife, the private woman, the person who had chosen smallness over ambition. And he had lived with that version so completely that the actual person had become invisible to him. Not because she'd hidden herself poorly, because he'd stopped looking. He had seen what was convenient to see. He had needed her to be ordinary so that his success could be his own, and she had allowed it. She had made herself small enough to fit into the story he was telling about himself, and he had accepted that accommodation without examining it, without asking why a woman this intelligent and this capable had chosen a life this quiet, without wondering what was underneath the surface she presented. He had never wondered. That was the thing that he could not set down. Not the betrayal, he couldn't even call it that because she'd supported him, she'd built things for him, she hadn't betrayed him at all. What she'd done was love him with a completeness he hadn't deserved and hadn't recognized and had walked away from in the direction of a woman who made him feel visible in the ways he understood visibility. He had traded depth for surface. He had done it knowing on some level he'd kept very quiet that what he was leaving was real and what he was moving toward was performance. He had known, and he had left anyway. That was the thing he sat with in the Astoria apartment at night. Not what she had done to him, what he had done to himself. On a Tuesday in February, 14 weeks after the gala, he was on the subway back to Astoria from work when his phone buzzed with a news alert. He looked at it without particular anticipation, the way you look at the 10th notification of a day. The headline read, "Whitmore Global Breaks Ground on Manhattan's largest affordable housing initiative. CEO Claire Whitmore announces 2,000-unit development." There was a photograph. She was standing at a construction site in a hard hat and a coat holding a shovel, laughing at something someone off camera had said. Genuine laughter, the unguarded kind, the kind that involved her whole face. He had not seen that laugh in a very long time. He read the article. The development was extraordinarily ambitious in scale, rigorous in design, rooted in a philosophy about housing that read between the lines like something she'd been thinking about for years, like something she'd had to put down while she was busy being invisible and had picked back up the moment she wasn't. He read it twice on the subway. Then he put his phone in his pocket. He sat with his hands on his knees and watched the tunnel go by outside the window and thought about the conference in Chicago 11 years ago, the terrible coffee, the way she'd walked up to him after his presentation and said with complete directness, the residential concept was alive. He had loved her from approximately that sentence. He had just been too busy becoming someone else to protect it. The subway arrived at his stop. He got off. He walked the 3 blocks to the apartment building where Gloria had strict policies about dishes, and he climbed the stairs and unlocked his door and stood in the small room that was his life. Now the drafting table he'd bought secondhand, the architecture books stacked against the wall, the window that looked out at someone else's window, and he felt for the first time in a long time something that was not grief or guilt or the cold arithmetic of consequence. He felt quietly and without drama like himself. Not the self he'd been performing for 4 years, the earlier one. The one that had been real before he'd learned to want things in the way the world told him to want them. It was not enough. He understood that. Feeling like yourself again was not the same as having done right by the people your wrong version had hurt. Those were different accounts, and they didn't cancel each other out. But it was a beginning. And Ethan Carter, architect 40 years old, Astoria Queen, sat down at his second-hand drafting table and opened his sketchbook to a blank page and began to draw. Not for a client, not for a portfolio, not for an industry profile or a magazine feature or a reputation that needed maintenance, just for the thing itself. Just because a building done right was a way of saying people matter. The space they move through matters. The light that reaches them at 3 p.m. in November matters. He had always known that. He had just spent a long time pretending he'd forgotten. The groundbreaking happened on a Wednesday morning in March, 4 months after the gala, and Claire was running 7 minutes late. Not because she was unprepared. She had been prepared for this specific morning for 3 months. The permits, the community board approvals, the financing structure, the architectural partnership agreements, all of it assembled with the same invisible precision she had once applied to rescuing Ethan's career. The difference was that this time her name was on it. Every document, every press release, every line of the development agreement. Claire Whitmore, CEO, Whitmore Global. She was late because her father had called at 7:40 in the morning and the call had gone longer than expected, which was something that happened when Richard Whitmore wanted to tell you something, but was approaching it indirectly, which was something he almost never did, which meant when he did it, you paid attention. The response to the affordable housing announcement, he said by way of opening. Good response, she said. She was in the car phone at her ear watching the city move past the window. The coverage was strong. Sandra sent me the metrics. I saw them. Claire. A pause. The particular pause she associated with him arriving at the actual point. I had a call yesterday from the Urban Development Coalition. They want a partner on the second phase. She sat with that for a moment. The Urban Development Coalition was not a small thing. It was not a polite phone call. It was the kind of institutional validation that took careers a decade to accumulate. That's fast, she said. Yes, her father said. It is. Another pause. I told them my daughter would call them back. She understood what he was not saying, which was that he was proud of her, which was something Richard Whitmore communicated through logistics, rather than sentiment, through the arrangement of opportunities, rather than the declaration of feelings. He had always been this way. She had spent years wishing he were different. She had arrived somewhere in the last 4 months at appreciating him exactly as he was. I'll call them this afternoon, she said. Good. He paused one more time, and then with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing to say something directly, for once, your mother would have loved today. She pressed her lips together for a moment. I know, she said. I know she would have. She arrived at the site 7 minutes late, got out of the car, accepted the hard hat from Sandra's assistant, and walked toward the assembled crowd. Community board members, city officials, press, residents from the surrounding neighborhood who had come because this project was being built for them, because the 2,000 units of affordable housing going up on this site were not a charity gesture or a tax incentive calculation, but a genuine attempt to keep people in the city they'd built their lives in. That had been her insistence, not her father's directive, hers. She had sat in a meeting 3 months ago when a senior vice president had presented a development model that was technically affordable by code definition and not affordable by any definition a real person would recognize, and she had looked at the numbers and said very quietly, no. The VP had blinked. Ms. Whitmore, the margin on this model. The margin is wrong, she said. Not mathematically, ethically, start over. The room had gone still in the way rooms go still when the person who just spoke is the person everyone answers to, and what they said was not what anyone expected. Sandra at the end of the table had looked at her notepad and made a small note and not looked up, which Claire had learned was Sandra's version of approval. They started over. It cost more. The margins were thinner. The project was better. That was the job, and she understood with increasing clarity each week exactly suited for it, not because of the name, not because of the inheritance, because she had spent 7 years studying the mechanics of how money moved through structures, how invisible decisions shaped visible outcomes, how the difference between a building that served people and one that merely stood was usually a decision made in a conference room by someone who either cared or didn't. She cared. She had always cared. She had just been applying it in the wrong direction. The groundbreaking ceremony lasted 40 minutes. She spoke for 6 of them without notes. She shook approximately 30 hands. She posed for photographs with a shovel and a hard hat and felt doing it not the self-consciousness she'd expected, but something simpler. She felt right. Afterward, Sandra fell into step beside her as they walked back to the car. "Urban Development Coalition," Sandra said. "I know. My father called. I told him not to call before the ceremony." "He ignored you." "He always ignores me," Sandra said. "It's our entire professional relationship." She paused. "There's something else." Claire looked at her. "Patricia called this morning." Sandra's voice was careful in the particular way it got careful when she was delivering information she wasn't sure Claire wanted. She said she saw Ethan Carter's name on a project submission, an affordable housing design competition. He submitted independently. The project... Sandra paused. "Patricia said it's good, Claire. She said it's the best thing he's ever done." Claire walked in silence for a moment. She had not spoken to Ethan since the gala. She had not sought information about him, had not asked Patricia to report, had simply let him be wherever he was doing whatever he was doing, moving through whatever consequence his choices had arrived at. She had not spent energy on it. She had genuinely been too busy. But she had read the news alert about his new job. She had not sought it out. It had arrived through an industry newsletter. She received a small item noting that former Carter architecture principal Ethan Carter had joined a Long Island City firm specializing in community development. She had read it once and set her phone down and felt something uncomplicated and final like a door closing cleanly. "What competition?" she said. "The city's Community Design Initiative, the one our foundation co-sponsors." A pause. "His submission is in the pool, one of 47. Claire was quiet. "I can remove our co-sponsorship," Sandra said, "if you want a clean separation." "No," Claire said. "If his work is good, it should be evaluated. That's how it works." She looked at Sandra. "Who's judging? Independent panel. Architecture faculty community advocates city planning." Sandra paused. "Not us." "Good," Claire said. "Leave it alone." Sandra nodded, made a note, let it go. The competition was not something Claire thought about after that conversation. She had a company to run a 2,000-unit development, to manage a second phase to plan, and a call to make to the Urban Development Coalition that went that afternoon significantly better than she'd expected better, because the man on the other end of the call had done his research and was not talking to a name. He was talking to the work, to the financing structure, to the design philosophy, to the decision to rebuild the margin model from scratch rather than use the easy number. He was talking to her, and she was ready for him. The weeks that followed moved at the pace she had set for herself, fast, deliberate, without the cautious self-editing that had characterized so many of her earlier years. She made decisions quickly because she understood the variables. She spoke in meetings without waiting to be invited because she had opinions that were worth hearing. She walked into rooms first. These were small things. They were enormous things. Patricia, who had lunch with her every 2 weeks because it had become a standing arrangement, neither of them had officially declared, but both of them maintained, watched her across a restaurant table in April and said, "You look different." "Different how?" "Like you stopped taking up less space than you're allowed." Patricia picked up her water. "It's a little intimidating, actually." "Good," Claire said. Patricia laughed. "How's your father?" "Healthy, opinionated. Slowly accepting that I'm going to make decisions he disagrees with and the company won't collapse." How's that going? He disagrees with my decisions, and then the results come in, and he stops disagreeing and moves directly to the next disagreement without acknowledging the previous one. She picked up the menu. It's entirely characteristic. I've decided it's a form of respect. It is, Patricia said, for Richard Whitmore at least. They ordered 8. And at the end of lunch, as they were putting on their coats, Patricia said casually, too casually, with the practiced ease of someone who had been deciding whether to say something for the duration of the meal, "I heard Vanessa is back in New York." Claire looked at her. "Not publicly," Patricia said quickly. "She's not doing the social media thing. Someone I know ran into her at a coffee shop in Brooklyn. She's apparently working for a nonprofit, communications director or something." Claire thought about Vanessa on the sidewalk outside the hotel, the diamond at her throat, the way she'd walked to the exit with her hand over it, not performing, just holding it, holding on to something. "Good," Claire said. "Good." "I mean it," Claire said. "I hope she figures out what she actually is when she's not performing. That's hard work. I hope she does it." Patricia studied her for a moment. "You're a more generous person than I am." "No," Claire said. "I just have enough of my own to not need to keep track of hers." It was on a Thursday evening in May, 6 months after the gala, that everything shifted again. Not dramatically, not with a ballroom and a screen and 300 witnesses. Life rarely repeated its grandest gestures. She was at a charity event at the New York Public Library, a literacy foundation benefit, smaller and quieter than the Whitmore Gala, the kind of event she'd started attending because the work interested her and not because the networking required it. She had arrived early, accepted a drink, and was standing near the back of the room, reviewing notes on her phone about the second phase permitting when someone said her name. Not her full name, just Claire, and she looked up. The man standing in front of her was approximately her age, with an open, direct face and the particular ease of someone who is entirely comfortable being exactly where they are without needing the room to confirm it. He was holding a water glass. He was wearing a suit jacket over a shirt that suggested the jacket was an afterthought. He looked like someone who had come because the cause mattered, and the event format was secondary. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said. "I recognize you from the Whitmore announcement. I'm Daniel Hayes. I run a workforce development organization. We build training programs for construction trades." He extended his hand. "We've been trying to get a meeting with your housing division for 6 weeks. I figured I'd try the direct approach." She looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed. It surprised her, the suddenness of it, the genuineness of it. "The direct approach," she said. "I respect that." She shook his hand. 6 weeks is too long. I'll have Sandra reach out Monday." Sandra Okafor. "You know Sandra." "She's terrifying," he said, "in the best possible way." "That's the most accurate description of Sandra I've ever heard." She put her phone away. "Tell me about the workforce programs." He told her. For 20 minutes, standing near the back of a library benefit, he described what his organization did with the specificity and urgency of someone who understood the work completely and believed in it without requiring anyone else to validate that belief. He talked about the gap between affordable housing construction timelines and trained labor availability. He talked about the communities he worked with. He talked about a program for formerly incarcerated workers that had a 78% employment retention rate, which he mentioned not as a talking point, but as something he'd been trying to understand and improve and was not yet satisfied with. She asked questions. He answered them directly without the practiced smoothness of someone running a pitch. When she asked something he didn't know the answer to, he said he didn't know, and he'd find out. She found standing there that she was not calculating, not managing the conversation from a distance, not editing herself for the room. She was just talking to someone. The way she'd talked at that conference in Chicago 11 years ago, the way she'd almost forgotten she could. "Monday," she said when the events program was about to start, and they both registered that they needed to find their seats. "Monday," he agreed. He paused. "I should tell you I know who you are, not just Whitmore Global. I read the coverage of the gala. What was said about the acquisition. Sci-si. A beat. I want you to know that's not why I'm here. I came to this event because the Literacy Foundation does work I believe in. I walked over and introduced myself because the housing project is genuinely aligned with what we do, and because the direct approach is usually more honest than 6 weeks of emails. He looked at her directly. I'm not interested in anything else. She held his gaze for a moment. I know, she said. I could tell. He nodded once with the simplicity of a man who accepts being believed without making a performance of it. She found her seat. He found his across the room. She paid attention to the program and thought with one small separate part of her mind that honesty had a particular quality, a texture you could identify once you'd been around enough of its absence to know what you'd been missing. Sandra called on Sunday evening, not Monday. Daniel Hayes, Sandra said without preamble. You're calling on a Sunday. Daniel Hayes, Sandra repeated. His workforce organization, the construction trades training. I know who he is. We met Thursday. A pause. I know you met Thursday. Patricia told me. Patricia told you. Patricia tells me everything relevant. That's why I like her. Another pause. His organization's annual report is public. The workforce outcomes are what he says they are. His board has no conflicts with our current partnerships. He has no history of Sandra. What, are you vetting a potential business partner or something else? Sandra was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Both, she said. It's efficient. Claire sat with this for a moment, leaning back in her chair at the Connecticut house, her house the uncomplicated one, the one she'd kept through everything, and looking at the ceiling. He's a good man, Sandra said. I'm not saying anything else. I'm just noting the data. The data, Claire said. That's all. She ended the call and sat in the quiet of the house and thought about data. About the particular data of someone who told you exactly why they were approaching you and what they wanted and what they were not interested in. About the specific and underrated quality of a person who was entirely willing to be known. She had loved Ethan Carter for 11 years. She understood now completely how much of those 11 years had been spent loving a version of him she'd constructed, filling the gaps in his self-knowledge with her own projections, substituting hope for observation, choosing the convenient interpretation over the accurate one. She had loved him partly because he needed her to, and that was not the same as being loved. She understood this now. She had worked it out slowly and without drama in the months since the gala. Not in a therapist's office, though she'd done that too. In the ordinary daily work of running a company and making decisions, and being wrong sometimes and finding out and correcting it. In the work of being a person who took up the space she was allowed and dealt with what that meant. She was not looking for anything. She was not lonely in the way that required filling. She was for the first time in her adult life genuinely complete in her own company. But she allowed herself to notice, not opposed to what good data looked like when it arrived. She called Daniel Hayes on Monday morning. Sandra set the meeting for Wednesday. The meeting went for 2 hours and covered workforce pipeline integration training facility, co-location within the development footprint, and a potential joint grant application that would expand the program's capacity by 40%. At the end of it, he said, "This is going to work." "I think so too," she said. A pause. The project, she said. And then, because she had learned finally to be honest at the speed she actually thought, "Ask me again in 6 months." He looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled, a real one, the kind that involved the eyes, the kind that wasn't performing anything. "Fair enough," he said. The moment Claire saw Ethan again happened by accident, and in daylight, which was nothing like the way she had imagined it in the years when she used to imagine such things. It was a Saturday in June, 7 months after the gala at an outdoor design showcase in Hudson Yards. She was there because Sandra had sent her a note about a community architects pavilion featuring emerging and returning practitioners, and she'd gone because the project philosophy aligned with her housing initiative, and because Saturday morning had been free, and she'd decided recently that free Saturday mornings were something to use rather than manage. She saw him across the pavilion before he saw her. He was standing beside a scale model, a community center design, clean and light-filled, even in miniature, the kind of structure that understood how people actually moved through space, rather than how architects like to imagine they did. He was talking to a woman who appeared to be a judge, and he was talking the way he'd talked at that conference in Chicago 11 years ago before he'd learned to perform, unfiltered, genuine, completely in it. She stood and watched him for a moment. He looked different. Not physically a little thinner, maybe the particular leanness of a life that had been simplified. But there was something in the way he stood that was new, or old. The earliest version of him, the one that had existed before success, had taught him how to carry it wrong. He looked like someone who had put something down. She had started to move away, not from discomfort, just because she'd seen what she needed to see, and there was nothing that required more when he looked up. Their eyes met across the pavilion. He went still. She stayed where she was. For a moment, they were simply two people in a Saturday crowd who had shared 11 years and a kitchen table and a great deal of invisible history, looking at each other in daylight without performance or strategy or audience. He took a step forward, then stopped. The question on his face was clear and honest and entirely without the calculation she'd once associated with him. She crossed the pavilion. Not quickly, not slowly, at the pace of someone who knows where they're going. She stopped a few feet from him and looked at the model beside him. "The community center," she said. "Is this the competition submission?" "Yes," he said. His voice was careful, trying to read the room. She studied the model, the light corridors, the way the central space opened toward the street, the particular intelligence of a design that understood people before it understood aesthetics. "It's the best thing you've ever done," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Patricia told you about the submission." "Sandra told me." "Patricia told Sandra." She looked up at him. "Did you win?" "Second place," he said. "The first place project was a school in the Bronx. It deserved it." A pause. I'm not saying that to be gracious. I looked at it, and it was better than mine, and I understood why." He paused again. "That's new, being able to see that clearly." "Yes," she said. "It is." They stood beside his model in the Saturday crowd, and the silence between them was not the silence of people who had run out of things to say, but of people who had more than they knew how to organize. "I owe you something," he said. "I've been thinking about how to say it for 7 months, and I don't have a version that doesn't sound inadequate, but I want to say it anyway." He looked at her directly. "I'm sorry, Claire. Not for the divorce. I think the divorce was right for both of us. I'm sorry for what I didn't see, for what I didn't ask, for the story I told myself about who you were because it was easier than actually knowing." He stopped. "I spent 11 years with you and I didn't know you. That's not your failure, that's mine." She listened to all of it. She did not rush it, and she did not deflect it, and she did not make it easier for him by meeting him halfway. "I know," she said when he was done. "Is that enough?" he said. "The apology. It's honest?" she said. "That's what it needed to be." He nodded. And then something in his face shifted into something quieter, something that was done with the formal part and was just him. "You look like yourself," he said, "more than you ever did." "I am," she said. "Finally," he smiled, small and real, and without any of the social performance that had once been the thing she'd recognized as his smile. "The housing development," he said, "the numbers I read about, 2,000 units, the margin decision." He shook his head slowly. "That's extraordinary work." "I know," she said simply. He laughed, a genuine one. "There it is," he said. "I always loved that about you, the way you just agreed with things that were true." She thought about the Chicago conference, the terrible coffee, the way he'd talked without editing himself. "Your work is good, Ethan," she said. "The real work, the work you're doing now." She looked at the model one more time. "Don't stop doing it." He looked at her for a moment, and she saw something pass through his face that was not hope, and was not grief, and was something in between those, the specific quiet reckoning of a person who understands what they had, what they chose, and what that means going forward. "I won't," he said. She nodded once, started to turn away. "Claire," his voice quiet. She turned back. "Are you happy?" he said, not as a performance, as a genuine question from a person who needed to know and understood they had no right to it and was asking anyway. She thought about this groundbreaking in March, her father's call, the library event and the direct approach, and the man who'd told her exactly why he was there and what he was not interested in. She thought about Sandra vetting someone on a Sunday because it was efficient. She thought about Patricia, who told everything to everyone relevant, and the standing lunch that neither of them had officially declared. She thought about the Connecticut house and free Saturday mornings, and decisions made at the speed she actually thought. She thought about her mother, who had looked at her at 19 years old and said, "You don't need to be smaller for anyone." She thought about the promise she'd made and finally, 7 years late, was keeping. "Yes," she said, and she meant it without caveat or qualification or the small silent asterisks she had attached to the word yes for most of her adult life. She was happy. Ethan Carter nodded slowly, and something in him settled visibly, the way structures settle when the last load-bearing piece finds its position. She turned and walked back through the Saturday crowd and into her life. Daniel Hayes was waiting at the pavilion entrance where they'd agreed to meet after she looked at the community architects section. He was holding 2 coffees. He handed her one without asking how she took it. She had mentioned it once 2 weeks ago at the end of a long meeting when coffee had seemed like a good idea and she'd specified black no sugar, and he had remembered without making a thing of it. That was the detail she noticed. Not a grand gesture, just evidence of a person who paid attention. "Good exhibit," he said. "Very good," she said. "Some extraordinary work in there." They walked out into the June morning into a city that was loud and imperfect and entirely itself, and the conversation they'd been building over 3 months of meetings and 2 months of something more continued the way it had been continuing honestly, at the speed of people who had no interest in pretending to be something they weren't. Claire Whitmore walked through Hudson Yards on a Saturday morning holding a black coffee and talking to a man who paid attention, and she was not hiding anything. Not her name, not her family, not her intelligence or her opinions, or the particular way she took up space in the world. She was in every room she entered completely and unapologetically herself. The woman who had stood in a hotel lobby in a $40 dress with champagne on her shoes saying nothing, deciding everything she had not been defeated that night. She had been ignited, and the fire that started in that lobby, in that silence, in that single moment of absolute clarity, had become something that built homes for 2,000 families, that changed the shape of a skyline, that carried her mother's face and her father's backbone and her own irreducible, uncontainable self. She had not needed anyone to recognize her worth. She had simply stopped pretending it wasn't there. And that, in the end, was the whole story. Not the fall of the people who had underestimated her, not the gala, not the screen, not the acquisition. Those were consequences. The story was simpler and older and more true than any of that. A woman decided to stop being invisible, and the world, which had always been waiting for her, finally got to see what it had been missing.